HOA Karen sends fake HOA police to confront black man. He's a federal agent. The man standing on my porch was wearing a yellow vest that said, HOA enforcement in bold black letters. His hand resting on a fake badge clipped to his belt. His chin lifted like he had every right to be there, and behind him, parked crookedly against my curb, was a golf cart with a flashing orange light on top. He pointed at me and said, "Sir, you are in violation of multiple HOA ordinances, and if you do not comply immediately, we will have your vehicle towed, your landscaping cited, and a lien placed on your property by end of business today." And I looked at him for one long second before I slowly reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my credentials. The color drained from his face the moment he read the words on that badge, because the woman who had sent him to my door, the woman who had orchestrated this entire performance, had just made the single worst mistake of her HOA career, and she didn't even know it yet. My name is Marcus Webb, and I have lived at 14 Cloverfield Lane in the Sycamore Ridge community of suburban Atlanta for 3 years. A quiet cul-de-sac with manicured lawns, American flags on every third porch, and a neighborhood newsletter that arrives every Tuesday like clockwork. I moved here with my wife Diane and our 2 kids, Jordan and Priya, after I accepted a reassignment from the DC field office. We wanted space, good schools, and the kind of neighborhood where kids could ride their bikes without me losing sleep, and for the first year and a half, Sycamore Ridge was exactly that. I am a special agent with the FBI Civil Rights Division, and I mention that not to impress anyone, but because it is the single fact that unravels everything that happens in this story, the one detail that Renata Holloway, HOA president and self-appointed queen of Sycamore Ridge, never bothered to find out before she decided I was her next target. I first noticed Renata Holloway at the welcome mixer the HOA threw in our honor. She arrived 20 minutes late, handed me a laminated copy of the community rulebook, and said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "We hold our standards very high here, Mr. Webb. I'm sure you'll find that refreshing." She was a tall white woman in her mid-50s with platinum blonde hair always set in the same stiff wave. A chunky gold bracelet she tapped constantly on whatever surface was nearest, and the practiced smile of someone who had spent decades making other people feel they were lucky to be tolerated. She had been HOA president for 11 years, longer than some of the families had lived in Sycamore Ridge, and in that time she had built a system of surveillance, documentation, and slow financial punishment that kept almost every homeowner in a low-grade state of anxiety. The rulebook she handed me at that mixer was 47 pages long, single-spaced, and covered everything from approved exterior paint colors, a palette of 12 neutrals, cross-referenced by Benjamin Moore Code, to the precise height at which trash bins could be visible from the street on non-collection days. My neighbor Tom Gallagher, a retired high school coach who had lived in Sycamore Ridge for 9 years, pulled me aside at that same mixer and said, quietly, "Just keep your head down with Renata. She's got eyes everywhere, and she doesn't forgive what she calls attitude problems." I thanked him and thought he was exaggerating. I had spent 20 years navigating federal bureaucracies, congressional oversight committees, and hostile interview rooms. I was not afraid of a homeowners association president. That confidence, I would later understand, was exactly what Renata Holloway could not stand. She needed people to be a little afraid of her, and I simply wasn't, and she noticed immediately. 3 weeks after we moved in, I received my first violation notice. A cream-colored envelope with the HOA seal embossed in blue on the front, informing me that the potted plants on my front steps were non-compliant in species and container color and must be removed or replaced within 14 days. I looked at those pots, 2 terracotta planters with ferns in them, the same kind I'd seen on at least 6 other porches in the neighborhood, and I thought, fine, I'll read the rule, I'll address it, I'll move on. But when I read Section 12, subsection C of the rulebook, it said containers must be neutral in tone, and terracotta, by any reasonable definition, is a neutral earth tone, so I took photos of my pots, photos of 3 other identical pots on nearby porches, and I sent a polite written response asking for clarification. Renata never clarified. Instead, exactly 15 days after my first notice, I received a second violation notice, this time for a failure to respond to HOA correspondence within the compliance window, accompanied by a $75 administrative fee. I paid the fee under protest, documented everything, and placed my letter of objection in certified mail. And that, I now believe, was the moment Renata Holloway decided I was a problem she intended to solve. Over the following 8 months, the notices kept coming. My grass was allegedly 1/4 inch above the maximum height on 2 separate occasions. My basketball hoop, portable, stored in the garage, was cited for being visible from the street because I had left the garage door open for 40 minutes on a Saturday afternoon. I got a notice because my recycling bin was 6 inches too close to the curb on a day the city delayed pickup. A notice because my Christmas lights stayed up until January 6th rather than January 1st. And a notice because a crack in my driveway, which had been there when I bought the house, was now classified as a safety hazard attributable to homeowner neglect. Every notice came with a fee, and every fee was tiered to escalate if not paid within 10 days. $75 became $150. $150 became $300, and Renata's cover letter always ended with the same line. The HOA board is here to help maintain the standards that protect everyone's property value. I kept paying, kept documenting, and kept sending polite letters because I know how institutional power works, and I knew that the fastest way to lose a fight like this was to appear emotional or reactive. But I was building a file quietly the same way I build a case. Diane noticed before I said anything out loud. She set her coffee down one morning and said, "Marcus, this woman is targeting us." And I told her she was right and that we were going to handle it correctly, and she gave me the look she always gives me when she knows I have a plan I haven't told her yet. Our neighbors had begun to notice too. The Nguyen's across the street told Diane that Renata had asked them, at the last HOA meeting, whether the new family ever had a lot of visitors coming and going at unusual hours. Phrasing that made Mrs. Nguyen so uncomfortable she drove straight home and told her husband. The Pattersons 2 doors down, a black family who had lived in the neighborhood for 6 years, came to our door one evening with a bottle of wine and a quiet warning. "She does this, Mr. Patterson said, sitting at our kitchen table. She picks someone and she just grinds them down until they either comply with whatever she wants or they sell and leave." He told me that he and his wife had been her previous target. A 2-year campaign of fines and notices that cost them nearly $4,000 before they hired an attorney and threatened a fair housing complaint, at which point the notices mysteriously stopped, and Renata moved on to a different neighbor. "She's careful," Mr. Patterson said, lowering his voice even though we were inside. "She never says anything that sounds racist. It's always the rules, always the process, always the standards. But look at who she goes after. Look at the pattern." I looked at the pattern. In 11 years, every extended enforcement campaign I could document, from HOA meeting minutes and public records I formally requested, had been directed at homeowners of color or homeowners who had publicly challenged Renata's authority. I requested 3 years of HOA financial records, meeting minutes, and violation logs through Georgia's HOA disclosure statutes. It took 2 formal written requests and a follow-up from an attorney, but I got them, and I spent an entire weekend at my kitchen table going through them with a yellow highlighter and a legal pad. The pattern was unmistakable. 11 homeowners had received sustained enforcement campaigns in 3 years. 9 of them were people of color. 1 was a white couple who had voted against Renata's re-election, and 1 was a single mother who had filed a formal complaint about the HOA's pool access policy. The escalation began in earnest on a Saturday in April. I was in the driveway washing my car, the ordinary kind of Saturday morning that belongs to every American neighborhood, when Renata pulled up in her white SUV and got out without being invited. She stood at the edge of my driveway in pressed linen slacks and her signature gold bracelet and said, "Mr. Webb, I've been meaning to speak with you directly. I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot, and I'd like to find a path forward. And her voice was warm and reasonable in a way that made the back of my neck go cold. I turned off the hose, dried my hands, and said, "I'm listening," because I wanted to hear exactly what she was going to say, and I wanted to remember every word of it. She told me that the board had been discussing my property. She used the word discussing the way a prosecutor uses the word reviewing, and that they felt I might benefit from a compliance consultation, which she explained was a voluntary meeting where a board member would walk the property with me and identify areas of concern. I said, politely but clearly, "Renata, I've been in compliance on every documented issue. The notices I've received have been inaccurate or selectively enforced, and I've put that in writing. I'm not interested in a compliance consultation." Something shifted behind her eyes, just for a half second, like a cloud crossing the sun, and then the warm smile came back and she said, "Of course, that's entirely your choice," and got back in her SUV and drove away, and I knew, with the certainty that comes from years of reading people, that I had just made her list. 2 days later, I got a certified letter. Not a standard violation notice, but a formal letter from the HOA's legal counsel, a firm called Whitmore and Associates, informing me that the board had voted to conduct a property compliance audit of my home and that I was required by Section 31 of the HOA's CC and RS to permit access within 30 days. I called my own attorney, a woman named Sandra Okafor who specializes in HOA law and fair housing. She had been on standby since the Patterson conversation, and she read the letter and said, "They can request an audit, but they cannot compel access to the interior of your home, and the exterior audit requires reasonable notice and a legitimate stated purpose. This letter doesn't meet the standard." Sandra sent a response to Whitmore and Associates that was 9 paragraphs long, precise, and courteous, which is a particular kind of devastating in legal correspondence. It invited the firm to identify the specific provisions being violated and noted that any audit would need to be conducted with a representative of the homeowner present. We heard nothing back for 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks I allowed myself to believe, briefly, that Renata had recognized she was in over her head and would redirect her energy elsewhere. I was wrong. On the first Tuesday of May, I arrived at the HOA's monthly meeting, held in the community room of our neighborhood's clubhouse, fluorescent lights, folding chairs, a projector screen with the HOA logo, and I found that my name was on the agenda. The agenda item was listed as 14 Cloverfield Lane, ongoing compliance review. And when I sat down in the second row with my notepad and my phone set to record legally, in Georgia, with one-party consent, Renata looked at me from behind the folding table at the front of the room, and her expression did not change at all. She opened the agenda item by saying the board had serious concerns about my property's compliance history and was considering placing a formal lien on the property for unpaid fines. She cited a total of $1,840 in outstanding fees, which was accurate because I had deliberately stopped paying in February while Sandra reviewed the legality of the charges. I raised my hand and was recognized, and I said, calmly, that the fees were under legal review, that my attorney had notified the HOA of that fact in writing, and that placing a lien on a property while fees were under disputed review was potentially actionable under Georgia law. Renata said, without pausing, "The board has reviewed the matter and does not believe the dispute meets the legal threshold for a stay of enforcement." And she moved to the next agenda item before I could respond. 3 of the other homeowners in the room, the Nguyen's, the Gallaghers, a young couple named the Hendersons, looked at me with the particular expression of people who want to say something and won't, and I nodded at each of them and wrote down everything that had just happened. After the meeting, Tom Gallagher caught me in the parking lot and said, in a low voice, "She's been talking to people, Marcus, telling them you're difficult, that you're trying to undermine the community, that you don't respect the process." And I said, "I know." And he said, "I just wanted you to know it's not working. Most people see what's happening. That same week, Renata launched what I can only describe as a ground campaign. She went door to door on Cloverfield Lane and the 2 adjacent streets, carrying a clipboard, telling homeowners that the board was considering a special assessment to cover legal costs related to a homeowner challenging the enforcement process. She didn't use my name, but everyone knew who she meant, and the message was clear. My refusal to comply was going to cost everyone money, and that was my fault, not hers. It was elegant in a malicious way. She was turning the neighborhood against me without saying anything technically false, and I had to admit, watching it unfold from my front window, that she was very good at this. But she had made one mistake, the same mistake every operator of this kind makes eventually. She had started moving faster than she could cover her tracks. In her rush to build a case against me, she had sent violation notices to my address on days when I could prove, with time-stamped photo evidence and vehicle GPS data, that my property was in perfect compliance, and that meant the notices were fabricated, not merely selectively enforced. Sandra flagged 3 specific notices: the January grass height citation, the March driveway citation, and an April notice about holiday decorations, where the dates on the notices did not align with any real inspection or enforcement activity, meaning someone had simply invented the violation. "That's fraud," Sandra said, over the phone, and she was quiet for a moment after she said it, the way lawyers are quiet when they are choosing their next words carefully, and then she said, "We need to decide how you want to handle this." I told Sandra I wanted to handle it the right way, which meant building a complete record before making any move, because the worst thing you can do when you have someone dead to rights is to act too soon and give them time to adjust their story. I began attending every HOA meeting, monthly general sessions, special sessions, the quarterly community beautification meetings that were really just Renata holding court for 90 minutes while people drank bad coffee and nodded, and I brought a notepad every time. At the June general meeting, Renata announced the formation of what she called the Community Compliance Team, a group of volunteers who would assist the HOA in monitoring neighborhood standards, and she presented it as a community-building initiative, a way to get more residents involved. The volunteers she named were 4 people I had seen at Renata's house over the past 2 months, 2 retired couples who were clearly in her inner circle, and the role she described for them included conducting drive-by inspections and photographing potential violations for board review. She was building a surveillance network using volunteers who had no legal authority whatsoever, dressed in the language of community engagement, and when I raised my hand to ask what training the volunteers would receive and what their authority was under Georgia law, she said the question was out of order for this agenda item. I sat back down and wrote it all in my notepad and thought, this is going to be the thing that breaks this open because she is about to overreach in a way that leaves evidence. I was right. Within 2 weeks, the compliance team had given 3 homeowners informal warnings, verbal and in writing on HOA letterhead, that implied consequences the HOA had no legal authority to impose, including 1 warning to a homeowner about a family member's parking habits on a public street. The homeowner who received the parking warning was a woman named Gloria Chun, a pediatric nurse who had lived in Sycamore Ridge for 4 years, and she came to my door with the letter in her hand and said, "Can they actually do this?" And I said, "No, they cannot." And I called Sandra. Sandra sent Renata a letter the next morning, brief, precise, and carrying the specific weight of an attorney who knows she's holding a winning hand, noting that HOA authority does not extend to public streets, and that issuing written warnings implying legal consequences the HOA cannot impose may constitute harassment. Renata did not respond through counsel. She responded by escalating. The very next week, she called a special session of the board and voted, with her 2 allied board members and against the objections of the 2 remaining board members, to expand the compliance team's mandate and to issue a formal community safety resolution. The resolution, which she mailed to every homeowner in Sycamore Ridge, described the HOA's new enforcement posture and included language about homeowners who have pursued litigation or threatened litigation against the association being subject to enhanced monitoring. And while it didn't name me, It described me precisely enough that 3 neighbors texted me within an hour of receiving it. I forwarded it to Sandra, who forwarded it to a fair housing attorney she knew in Atlanta, who called me that evening and said, in a voice that was equal parts professional and impressed, she just put potential retaliation against a homeowner who threatened legal action into a public document. That is extraordinarily careless. I asked him what he recommended, and he said, keep collecting. She's not done yet. He was right, Renata was not done because people like Renata never stop when they're winning, and they especially don't stop when they're not winning but believe they are. In July, she hired a private property inspection company to conduct what she called a comprehensive community assessment. A firm called Crestline Property Solutions, which, when I looked it up, had been incorporated 14 months earlier and had Renata's college roommate listed as the registered agent. Crestline issued a report on my property that cited 19 separate violations, ranging from roof discoloration inconsistent with community standards. My roof was 3 years old and had been inspected 6 months prior, to interior window coverings visible from the street that do not meet aesthetic guidelines. I had Roman shades, in white. The report was signed by a certified property inspector named Dale Hutchins, whose certification, when Sandra ran it through the state licensing database, had expired 18 months ago. Sandra sent a letter to Crestline, to Whitmore and Associates, and to the HOA board, noting the expired certification, requesting the inspection methodology, and preserving all claims related to the fraudulent report, and Crestline stopped responding to communications within 48 hours. But the HOA board, under Renata's direction, used the Crestline report to impose $3,200 in new fines, bringing my alleged outstanding balance to just over $5,000, and formally initiated the lien process on my property. A lien against my home, based on a report from a firm run by Renata's college roommate, signed by an inspector whose license had expired, for violations that included the color of my window shades. Diane sat down at the kitchen table when I told her, and she was very quiet for a long time, and then she said, "How long are we going to let this go on, Marcus?" And I reached across the table and took her hand and said, "Not much longer." What Renata didn't know, what she couldn't have known because she had never asked, never looked, never considered the possibility that the black man on Cloverfield Lane might have resources she couldn't anticipate, was that I had quietly been in contact with the FBI's Atlanta field office for 6 weeks. Not about Renata specifically, not yet, but about a pattern of potential civil rights violations that I had been documenting. And the Atlanta office had an attorney from the Civil Rights Division who had been listening to my notes with increasing interest. I also had a contact at the Georgia Real Estate Commission, a contact at the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, and a former colleague who was now a senior investigator at HUD's Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Office. I had been building a case the way I was trained to build cases, patiently, completely from the ground up, and the lien filing was not a disaster. It was the moment the case became solid enough to act on. But before I could act, Renata made a move I had not anticipated. One that accelerated everything by several weeks and introduced a level of absurdity I genuinely could not have predicted. In the 3rd week of August, Renata officially announced, at a general HOA meeting attended by 31 homeowners, the creation of what she called the HOA Community Patrol, a volunteer enforcement unit that she described as a visible deterrent to noncompliance. The patrol, she explained, would wear identifying vests, carry documentation materials, and have the authority to issue verbal warnings and photograph violations. She presented laminated ID cards and yellow vests with HOA enforcement printed on them in large block letters. The 2 remaining board members who had opposed her on the community safety resolution both tried to object. One of them, a retired attorney named Phil Kessler, said clearly, "Renata, you cannot dress people up like law enforcement and send them to confront homeowners. This is going to create a serious legal problem." But she called the objection out of order and moved forward. Phil Kessler sent me a text message that same night. She voted it through, 2-3. You need to know this is happening. I thanked him and called Sandra. Sandra said, she's created a paramilitary-style enforcement unit with no legal authority, uniforms designed to imply official capacity, and she's going to deploy them against homeowners, including you. She paused. How would you like to proceed? I said, let her deploy them. I want her to deploy them. Sandra was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, and then said, okay, tell me when. I didn't have to wait long. The following Saturday morning, I was in my driveway washing my car. The same thing I was doing the day Renata first came to speak with me. A detail I find almost too perfect, when the golf cart rolled up. The man in the yellow vest was named Gary Pruitt. I would learn his name later. A retired postal worker and Renata's next-door neighbor who had been recruited as a patrol volunteer because he, as Renata had told him, cared about community standards. He was a nervous-looking man in his mid-60s who was clearly not comfortable with what he had been sent to do. He stood at the edge of my driveway and read from a laminated card the violations Renata had prepared for him, and his voice shook slightly on the part about the lien, and when he finished he looked up at me with the expression of a man who was already regretting agreeing to this. I looked at Gary Pruitt for a long moment, at his yellow vest, his fake badge, his golf cart with the flashing orange light, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, but a kind of clarity, the particular calm that settles over me when I know exactly what I'm about to do. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out my credentials, my FBI special agent badge and photo ID, and I held them open in front of Gary's face the same way I have held them in front of suspects, witnesses, and reluctant bureaucrats for 20 years. Gary stared at the badge. He stared at it for what felt like a full 10 seconds, during which the color left his face in a slow, visible tide. And then he said, in a voice barely above a whisper, I had no idea. I said, I know you didn't, Gary, because I could tell immediately that he was a man who had been used, not a man who had intended any harm, and that distinction matters to me. I'm going to ask you to go home now. He went. He left so fast the golf cart nearly jumped the curb, the orange light still spinning, and I stood in my driveway for a moment watching him go, and then I went inside and called Sandra Okafor. It happened, I said. They sent someone to my door in a uniform with a fake badge to issue violations and threaten a lien. I have it on my porch camera, full HD, full audio. Sandra said, send me the file right now. And I could hear, underneath her professional composure, the particular satisfaction of an attorney who has been waiting for exactly this moment. I sent the video and then I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop and reviewed everything. My full documentation file, now 3 binders and 2 external hard drives, organized chronologically and cross-referenced by regulation citation and date. Diane came downstairs in her Saturday morning robe, poured coffee, saw my face and said, it happened, didn't it? And I said yes. And she set her mug down and said, very quietly, good. I want to be clear about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't triumph, not yet, because the work wasn't done. It was the feeling of standing at the beginning of the end of something and knowing with professional certainty that the end was going to be very hard for Renata Holloway. Sandra called me back within 2 hours of receiving the video. I could hear her moving around her office, the quick rhythm of someone who has shifted from planning mode to execution mode, and she said, Marcus, this video is exactly what I thought it was. We need to talk about sequencing. Sequencing in legal strategy is everything. It means understanding which action triggers which response and making sure you control the order of events so that your opponent is always reacting to you, never the other way around. Sandra laid it out. First, a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA to Whitmore and Associates, and to Renata Holloway personally, alleging fraudulent enforcement, harassment, and violation of Georgia's HOA statutes. Second, a fair housing complaint filed simultaneously with HUD. Third, a complaint to the Georgia Real Estate Commission regarding the Crestline inspection report. We would hold the criminal referral. Impersonation of law enforcement is a misdemeanor in Georgia, and the fake badge could support it, as a final card, to be played only if Renata escalated further or refused to negotiate. I agreed with the sequencing, but I added one element Sandra hadn't mentioned. I was going to present a full briefing to my contact in the FBI Atlanta field office, not as an agent working his own case, but as a private citizen who had documented a pattern of potential civil rights violations, and I was going to do it through the proper channels, fully disclosed, with my field supervisor's knowledge. My supervisor, Assistant Special Agent in Charge Teresa Ramos, had known about the situation for 2 months. I had told her early because I operate with full transparency and because she is exactly the kind of leader who needs to know when one of her agents is in a situation that could become complicated. Teresa had listened to my briefing with the same quiet intensity she brings to everything, and at the end she had said, "You're handling this right, Marcus. Keep me informed, and document everything." Then she paused and added, "Everything," with the emphasis that means, "You know what you're doing? Now do it." I called Teresa on Sunday morning and gave her the update, the golf cart, the yellow vest, the fake badge, the video, and she was silent for 5 seconds, which is a long time for Teresa, and then she said, "Send me the briefing memo by tomorrow morning. I want the Atlanta Civil Rights Unit to see this." I wrote the memo that afternoon, 12 pages, single-spaced, with a document index that ran to 4 additional pages, and I sent it at 11:47 p.m. on Sunday, because I am constitutionally incapable of sleeping when there is a memo to be written. Monday morning, Sandra sent the cease and desist. It arrived at Renata's door by certified mail at 10:14 a.m., and at Whitmore and Associates' office at 10:32 a.m., and I know the exact times because Sandra's paralegal tracked the deliveries. By noon, Renata had called 3 neighbors. I know because the Nguyen's called Diane, and the Hendersons texted me directly to tell them that I was suing the HOA and that it was going to cost every homeowner thousands of dollars, and that this was exactly the kind of hostility the community didn't need. The framing was vintage Renata. She wasn't the one who had fabricated violations and hired an unlicensed inspector and sent a man in a fake uniform to my porch. She was the victim of an attack by a difficult homeowner who was weaponizing the legal system. But this time, the framing wasn't landing the same way it had before, because the Hendersons who texted me said that when Renata finished her version of events, Carla Henderson had looked at her and said, "Renata, we saw the porch camera video. Gloria showed everyone in the book club." Gloria Chun, the pediatric nurse who had come to my door with the parking warning letter, had apparently shared the porch camera footage, which I had given to her as a record of what the HOA patrol was doing, with her Tuesday book club, which included 9 women from the neighborhood. I had not orchestrated this. I want to be clear about that. But I also cannot say I was surprised, because when you give people evidence of an injustice and they care about their community, they share it. By Tuesday evening, Whitmore and Associates had responded to Sandra's cease and desist, not with a substantive reply, but with a letter requesting a 30-day extension to review the claims and consult with the board, which is attorney language for, "We need time to figure out how bad this is." Sandra granted 15 days, not 30, and she sent along a supplemental letter that attached the porch camera footage as an exhibit and noted that the HOA's compliance team activity may have violated Georgia Code Section October 16, 23, which criminalizes impersonation of law enforcement officers or officials. I am told, by Phil Kessler, who remained my best source inside the board, that when Renata received the letter from Whitmore and Associates forwarding Sandra's supplemental, she read it twice, stood up from her kitchen table and said, "He's trying to have people arrested. This is a war." It wasn't a war. It was a reckoning. But I understand why she couldn't tell the difference. People who have operated without consequences for a very long time tend to experience accountability as an attack. Renata's response to the cease and desist period was not to stand down. It was to accelerate, as though speed could outrun consequence, as though if she could just do enough damage fast enough, I would tire of fighting and go away. On Wednesday of that week, the HOA patrol, still operating, in defiance of both the cease and desist and the objections of 2 board members. Issued written warnings to 7 homeowners in a single afternoon sweep, including the Nguyen's, the Hendersons, and Gloria Chun. The warnings were petty: a garden hose left coiled on a porch, a welcome mat that wasn't neutral in tone, a mailbox flag left in the upright position past noon. But the message was clear. Renata was demonstrating that she could still enforce, still punish, still control. Every one of those homeowners called or texted me within 24 hours. Every one of them was angry, and 3 of them, the Nguyen's, Gloria Chun, and the Hendersons, asked if they could be included in any legal action I was pursuing. I told them to call Sandra Okafor. By Friday, Sandra had 4 new clients and a significantly expanded complaint. Phil Kessler called me on Saturday. His voice was tighter than usual, the voice of a man who has been sitting on information and has finally decided it's too important to sit on. And he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand I'm only telling you because what she's doing is wrong." He told me that at a closed board session the previous evening, a session he had only learned about after the fact, because Renata had not notified him or the other dissenting board member. Renata had called a special vote and passed a resolution authorizing the HOA to retain an investigative firm to research the background of homeowners engaged in litigation with the association. "She voted to investigate you personally, Marcus," Phil said. "She wants to find something she can use. Something that makes you look bad. Something she can leak to neighbors. Something that changes the story." I absorbed this. I was not surprised. I had dealt with subjects who did exactly this, who, when cornered by evidence, tried to flip the narrative by attacking the witness. But I was struck by the boldness of it, the willingness to spend HOA funds on a personal vendetta that she was dressing up as due diligence. I thanked Phil and told him to document everything he could. Notes, dates, meeting minutes, and I called Teresa Ramos immediately. Teresa listened to all of it and then said, "Marcus, I'm going to escalate the briefing. The pattern here, the investigation authorization, the fake enforcement unit, the targeting, this is no longer just an HOA dispute." She didn't tell me what escalation meant operationally because that's not how Teresa works. She tells you what she's decided to do, not the step-by-step, but I understood that the Atlanta Civil Rights Unit was now formally interested. The investigative firm Renata retained was called Meridian Consulting Group. I found the incorporation records within 2 days, and it was predictably connected. The owner, a man named Brett Holloway, was Renata's husband's first cousin, which meant she was using HOA funds to hire a relative's company to investigate me. Sandra added the self-dealing element to the complaint file and sent a supplemental letter to Whitmore and Associates, noting that the retention of Meridian without competitive bidding or board disclosure may violate the HOA's own fiduciary duty provisions. Whitmore and Associates did not respond. 2 days later, I learned from Phil that the firm had withdrawn as HOA counsel, a detail that Renata had not disclosed to homeowners and that Phil had only discovered by calling the firm's main number himself. An HOA that has lost its legal counsel during an active dispute is an HOA in serious trouble. It means the attorneys looked at the liability picture and decided they didn't want to be associated with it, and I sat with that information for 24 hours before deciding what to do with it. I shared it with Gloria Chun, who shared it with her book club, and by the following Tuesday morning, the entire neighborhood knew that Renata Holloway's HOA had lost its lawyers. The phones started ringing, Renata's phones, the HOA's general inquiry line, and people were asking questions she couldn't answer with the smooth confidence she was used to projecting, and for the first time I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was rattled. But rattled didn't mean stopped. Rattled meant desperate. And Renata desperate was more dangerous than Renata confident, because she no longer had anything to lose by escalating. On a Tuesday evening in mid-September, I came home from work to find a folded note tucked under my windshield wiper. No envelope, no signature, just a single typed line. Federal employees should not be using their position to intimidate private citizens. This will be reported. I photographed it, bagged it, and brought it inside. The threat was vague and legally meaningless, but the implication was clear. Someone had found out I worked for the federal government and was planning to weaponize that information by suggesting I was abusing my authority. I called Teresa that evening and read the note to her over the phone. There was a pause, and then Teresa said, in the dry voice she uses when she is genuinely annoyed, "She's going to file a complaint against you with the Bureau." I said I thought so too, and Teresa said, "Good, let her." When they receive a frivolous complaint against a sitting agent who has filed documentation with our office showing he's the victim of a civil rights pattern, that complaint becomes part of the record, and it won't reflect well on the complainant. Renata filed the complaint 4 days later. I know because I received a courtesy call from the Bureau's Office of Professional Responsibility informing me that a complaint had been received and that it was being reviewed, and the reviewing agent, once he had read the briefing memo I had pre-filed, closed the complaint within 6 hours without further inquiry. He called me back to confirm closure and said, in a tone that was carefully neutral, "Agent Webb, the complaint did not meet the threshold for investigation. You may want to be aware that filing a false complaint against a federal officer carries its own consequences." He paused. "I'm sure the complainant is aware of that." She was not aware of that. Or rather, she was about to become aware of it in a way that would leave a mark. The same week the complaint was closed, Meridian Consulting Group, the firm Renata's husband's cousin ran, delivered its report to Renata. I don't know what was in it, but I know that within 24 hours of its delivery, Renata made a phone call to Tom Gallagher in which she said, "I found something on Marcus Webb that is going to change everything." Tom called me immediately, because Tom Gallagher is a man of genuine decency who had watched what was happening in his neighborhood for months and had had enough. And he said, "Marcus, she's going to try to use something against you. I don't know what it is." I had no secrets that Meridian could have found. My record is clean, my finances are in order, my professional history is documented and reviewed by people far more rigorous than Renata Holloway. But I knew that truth wouldn't stop her from lying, and that whatever she had found or fabricated, she was going to use it. I told Tom, "Let her. Thank you for telling me." And I went back to the kitchen table where Diane was waiting, and I told her everything, and she held my hand and said, "She's out of moves, Marcus. She just doesn't know it yet." I believed Diane was right, but I was also watching the clock, because there was a window in which Renata could cause real, lasting damage if I let her operate freely for too much longer, and I was reaching the point where the record was complete enough to act. What happened next is what I did not fully anticipate. Not the event itself, because I had considered the possibility, but the speed and the public nature of it, the sheer lack of restraint. Renata Holloway, operating on whatever Meridian had reported, placed a post in the Sycamore Ridge Community Facebook group, a post visible to all 847 members of the group, homeowners and renters alike, that read, "As your HOA president, I have a duty to inform this community when I believe a resident may pose a safety concern. I have received information about a current resident at 14 Cloverfield Lane that I believe warrants community awareness. I am calling a special community meeting for this Thursday at 7 p.m. She did not name me in the post. She didn't have to. Everyone knew who lived at 14 Cloverfield Lane, and the language she used, safety concern, community awareness, warrants, was designed to suggest something dangerous without stating anything specific. I read the post at 6:47 a.m. while still in bed, and I put my phone down, and I looked at the ceiling for exactly 60 seconds, and then I got up and called Sandra Okafor and said, "It's time." Sandra said, "Tell me exactly what she posted," and I read it to her word by word, and when I finished she said, "That post is defamation per se in the state of Georgia. She's implied you are dangerous to the community without factual basis, and she did it publicly to 847 people." "I know," I said. "Screenshot it. I need it preserved before she deletes it." Already done, Sandra said. My paralegal has it timestamped, archived. What do you want to do about Thursday? I told her I was going to show up on Thursday, and I was going to let Renata say whatever she planned to say, in front of the entire community, in a recorded forum, because the difference between a private lie and a public lie is the audience, and Renata had just chosen the largest audience available to her. What I didn't tell Sandra, not yet, was that I had reached out to Teresa Ramos that same morning and asked whether the Atlanta Civil Rights Unit was ready to move, and Teresa had said, "We've been ready for 10 days. I was waiting for your word." The Civil Rights Unit had been quietly building its own case alongside mine, reviewing the pattern of enforcement across Sycamore Ridge, interviewing homeowners with their consent, on background, and working with HUD on the Fair Housing Complaint file, and the Thursday community meeting was, from their perspective, an ideal public forum. 2 days before the meeting, Renata sent a second post in the community group, a clarification that said she had spoken with legal counsel. She had no legal counsel. Whitmore and Associates had withdrawn, and that the Thursday meeting would cover important community safety information that every homeowner deserves to know. The post generated 214 comments, most of which were some variation of "What is going on?" and "Is this about the HOA dispute?" And Renata responded to each one with a version of "Please come Thursday and hear the full story," while declining to provide any specifics. She was building a crowd. She thought a crowd was power. She hadn't considered that a crowd is also a witness. On Wednesday evening, I received a hand-delivered envelope, left in my mailbox, no return address, that contained what I can only describe as a dossier. 12 pages of information about me, some accurate, some wildly distorted, assembled from public records and what appeared to be social media surveillance. The dossier characterized several of my past case assignments as evidence that I had personal vendettas against community organizations, misrepresented a 2019 disciplinary review. I had filed a complaint against a superior, who was later removed from his position. The review cleared me as a bureau misconduct finding, and included photographs of my car at various locations around Atlanta that were clearly intended to suggest surveillance. Someone had been watching me. Not Renata personally, she didn't have the skills or the patience for field work, but whoever she had hired at Meridian had been competent enough to conduct a basic surveillance operation, and I was looking at the product of it. I photographed every page of the dossier, placed it in an evidence bag, and called Teresa. "She's got a surveillance file on me," I said, "compiled by a private firm." Teresa said, "Photographing a federal agent without his knowledge as part of a harassment campaign may implicate federal statutes. Send me the file tonight." I sent it. Teresa called back at 11 p.m. and said, "Thursday meeting. We'll have people there." I slept 5 hours. Diane sat with me at the kitchen table for a long time after the kids were in bed, and she said something that has stayed with me. She said, "I need you to remember, when this is over, that we didn't become the people she tried to make us." I told her I remembered that every day. Thursday came with a clear sky and a hint of early fall in the air, the kind of Atlanta evening where the heat breaks just enough that people will stand outside and talk, which is exactly what happened in the Sycamore Ridge clubhouse parking lot before the 7 p.m. meeting. Clusters of neighbors talking in low voices, everyone aware that something large was about to happen. I arrived at 6:45 with Diane, and we walked through the parking lot speaking to everyone we passed. The Nguyen's, the Pattersons, Gloria Chun with her book club group, the Hendersons, Tom Gallagher, Phil Kessler, and the atmosphere had none of the low-grade anxiety of a usual HOA meeting. It had the specific tension of a crowd that has already decided something and is waiting to see it confirmed. Phil pulled me aside near the door and said quietly, "She's in there with Gary Pruitt and 2 other patrol members. They're in the vests, and she's got a projector set up and a printed presentation." He shook his head. "Marcus, she's going to try to present the dossier." I said, "Good." And Phil looked at me the way people look at you when your calm makes them more nervous than your anger would. and then we went inside. The room was arranged with Renata's folding table at the front, the projector screen behind her, and 3 rows of folding chairs filling up fast. By 6:55, there were 67 people in the room, which was more than I had ever seen at an HOA meeting, and more were coming in from the parking lot. Renata stood at the front in a white blazer, her gold bracelet, her perfect stiff wave, and she held a clicker for the presentation and smiled the smile of a woman who believed she was moments from a triumph. She did not look at me when I sat down, which told me she had noticed me immediately. At 7:01, Renata called the meeting to order and said, "Thank you all for being here. I know this is unusual, but the board has a responsibility to this community, and I have information tonight that I believe every homeowner deserves to hear." She clicked to her first slide, which said Community Safety Concern, an update for Sycamore Ridge homeowners, and she began to speak, a carefully constructed narrative about patterns of behavior and concerns raised by multiple residents and information obtained through due diligence that danced around what she actually wanted to say without quite saying it. She talked for 9 minutes before she got to me by name, and when she did, she said, "The homeowner at 14 Cloverfield Lane has engaged in a sustained campaign to undermine this community's standards, has threatened legal action against the association, and has, according to information in my possession, a professional history that raises serious questions about his conduct and character." She clicked to a slide that contained 3 bullet points from the dossier: the misrepresented disciplinary review, a distorted summary of a case assignment, and a photograph of my car parked outside our neighborhood taken from what looked like a public street. The room was very quiet. I looked around at the faces, 67 of my neighbors, the people who shared this street and this community with me and my family, and most of them had expressions that were not what Renata expected, which was not shock or alarm but something closer to discomfort, the particular discomfort of watching someone do something wrong in a public place. I raised my hand. Renata ignored it. I raised it again. She said, "I'll take questions at the end," and clicked to the next slide. From the back of the room, a voice said clearly, "Renata, I think he should be able to respond right now." It was Tom Gallagher, and his voice carried the particular authority of a man who coached high school football for 30 years and does not raise it unnecessarily. Several other voices agreed. Not a chorus, but enough, 5 or 6 people saying, "Let him speak," in the tone that signals a room has already made a judgment. And Renata looked out at her audience, and I watched her understand, in that moment, that the crowd she had built was not the crowd she had wanted. She said, "This isn't a debate," and her voice had lost the warmth, and underneath it was something harder and less composed. The voice she probably used in private when the pleasant performance wasn't necessary. I stood up. I did not ask for the floor again. I stood up and faced the room, not Renata, because I was speaking to my neighbors, not to her, and I said, in a voice that was quiet and even, "My name is Marcus Webb. I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division. I have been an agent for 20 years. The information on that slide is false." I let that land for a moment, and then I said, "What is true is this. I have been documenting HOA enforcement activity in this neighborhood for 8 months. I have documented fraudulent violation notices, a property inspection report signed by an inspector whose license had expired, a surveillance operation conducted against me using HOA funds, a complaint filed against me with my employer that was closed within 6 hours, and a formal surveillance dossier assembled by a firm hired with your HOA dues." I turned slightly, just enough to gesture toward the projector screen without looking at it, and I said, "The presentation you're watching is being made with material from that dossier. I have the original. I've shared it with the FBI's Atlanta field office, with HUD's Fair Housing Office, and with the Georgia Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division." The room had gone completely still, not the aggressive silence of a crowd being controlled, but the genuine silence of 67 people absorbing something they had not expected to hear. Renata said, "This is exactly the kind of intimidation I've been talking about. Using his federal position to—" A woman near the back said, "Renata, stop." It was Mrs. Nguyen, and her voice was not loud, but it cut through everything, and Renata stopped, because even she understood that the moment Mrs. Nguyen, who had never spoken at an HOA meeting in 9 years, told her to stop, the room had already moved away from her. Phil Kessler stood up from his seat and said, "I'm a board member. I want the record to reflect that I and board member Donovan Harris were not informed of this meeting's agenda in advance, did not approve the materials being presented, and formally object to this presentation as unauthorized use of the HOA platform." Renata turned to Phil with an expression that was no longer composed at all. It was the expression of someone who has just watched their plan dissolve in real time, and she said, "Phil, you're out of order." And Phil said, "I don't think I am, Renata. And I don't think you are in a position to decide that tonight." The room broke into several conversations at once, the particular chaos of a crowd that has held its breath too long, and in the middle of it, the clubhouse door opened and 3 people in business casual clothing walked in and moved quietly to the side of the room. I recognized one of them, Agent Carla Sutton from the Atlanta Civil Rights Unit, who I had worked with on a housing case 3 years ago, and I met her eyes briefly and she gave the smallest nod and I turned back to the room. Renata had also noticed the 3 people who walked in. She had the instincts of a predator, and the arrival of unknown adults in business casual at a moment of maximum chaos would have registered immediately, and I watched her look at them and then look at me, and for the first time in all the months I had known her, I saw something that might have been fear. Agent Sutton did not cross the room or announce herself. She simply stood near the wall with her 2 colleagues and watched, because her presence was informational, not operational, and the information it conveyed to Renata was, "You are no longer the most powerful person in this room, and you haven't been for some time." Phil Kessler was still on his feet, and he said, in a voice that was steady and clear, "I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in the current board president. I need a second from any homeowner present." He looked around the room. Any homeowner. Every hand that went up, and they went up slowly, then all at once like a wave, was a hand belonging to someone who had decided months or years ago that this was where they stood and had been waiting for the moment to stand there publicly. I counted 22 hands in the air, more than a third of the room, more than enough to carry a non-binding vote of no confidence under the HOA's own bylaws, which required only a simple majority of homeowners present at a properly convened meeting. Phil Kessler said, clearly and for the record, "I count 22 votes in favor. I count 0 opposed. The homeowners of Sycamore Ridge have expressed no confidence in the current board president. I am entering this into the meeting minutes." Renata's gold bracelet hit the folding table with a sharp crack. She had slammed her hand down, and she said, "This meeting is not properly convened and that vote has no legal standing." And her voice had finally shed the last of its performance quality. What was left was raw and harsh and unmistakably the voice of someone who was losing. Phil said, "The meeting was convened by you, Renata. You sent the notification. You set the time. You established the quorum. Whatever authority this meeting has, you created it." He paused. "Including the authority to record a no-confidence vote." I have thought about that moment many times since, the precision of it, the way Phil turned Renata's own mechanism against her, and I think it was the finest piece of procedural combat I have ever witnessed in a civilian context. Renata pointed at me and said, "This is his doing. He has orchestrated all of this. He has manipulated this community. And when the truth comes out about what kind of person he really is..." And she stopped because Gloria Chun stood up from the third row. Gloria is not a large woman. She is a pediatric nurse who is kind to every person she encounters and laughs at everything and brings food to neighbors when they're sick. She stood up and said, in a voice that was perfectly level, "Renata, I've lived here for 4 years. You sent someone to my door in a yellow vest over a garden hose. My garden hose. She let that sit. Don't talk to me about what kind of person anyone is. The room responded to Gloria the way rooms respond to simple truth, with the quiet that means everyone is thinking the same thing at the same time. And Renata looked at Gloria and then looked away, and the looking away was itself a kind of answer. Agent Sutton stepped forward then. Not dramatically, no announcement, simply moving from the wall toward the center of the room in the measured way of federal agents who don't need theatrics because they have authority. And she said, "Good evening. My name is Carla Sutton. I'm a special agent with the FBI's Atlanta field office. I'm not here to conduct a law enforcement action tonight. I'm here as an observer, and I'd like to say, for the record, that anything said in this room is being noted by federal personnel." The effect of that statement was immediate and specific. Every member of the HOA patrol who was wearing their yellow vest took the vest off within 90 seconds. I watched Gary Pruitt fold his vest carefully and put it under his chair, and I thought, that is a man who is genuinely relieved to be done with this. Renata said, "You have no authority here," and Sutton said, "I'm not claiming any. I'm simply present. Please continue," and sat down in a folding chair with the unhurried ease of someone who has nowhere else to be, and Renata had no response to that at all. Phil said, "I'd like to move that the board suspend all HOA patrol activities effective immediately, pending legal review," and Donovan Harris, the other dissenting board member who had been silent all evening, said, "Seconded," and Phil said, "All in favor?" and the room said as one, "Aye." Renata did not vote. She stood at the front of the room with her clicker in her hand, the projector still showing the dossier slide behind her, and she looked like a woman who was only now comprehending the distance between where she had been and where she was. Tom Gallagher raised his hand and was recognized and said, "I'd also like to move that the board engage independent legal counsel to conduct a full audit of all HOA enforcement actions in the last 3 years, with results reported to homeowners." Phil seconded it. Passed. Someone in the back, I never identified who, said, "What about the lien on the Webb property?" And Phil said, "All lien proceedings against 14 Cloverfield Lane are suspended, pending the legal review." And that statement produced something I was not expecting. A ripple of applause, small but real, from people who had seen something unjust being corrected. Diane, sitting next to me, took my hand under the table and I held it, and I did not let myself look at Renata, because I did not want my face to show triumph. Because triumph would have been wrong. What I felt was not triumph but relief, the kind that comes after a long piece of work is finally done. Renata gathered her materials, her clicker, her printed presentation, her carefully assembled dossier, with the mechanical movements of someone whose body is operating while their mind is somewhere else entirely, and she said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "This isn't over?" And Phil said, gently but clearly, "Renata, I think it is." She walked to the door. Nobody followed her. Nobody called after her. The room simply let her go, which is a particular kind of ending. Not dramatic, not confrontational, just a woman walking through a door while 67 people watched in silence and then turned back to the business of figuring out what came next. After she left, the meeting continued for another 45 minutes, the most productive HOA meeting I had ever attended, during which the homeowners present voted to establish a temporary oversight committee to freeze all non-essential HOA spending pending the audit, and to formally invite Sandra Okafor to present a summary of the legal issues at the next general meeting. When the meeting finally broke up and people spilled out into the parking lot, something happened that I want to record because it mattered to me. Neighbor after neighbor came to speak to me and Diane, not formally, not with speeches, just with the kind of direct, plain acknowledgement that is the best of American social life. "We should have said something sooner," and "I'm sorry this happened to you," and "We see you." Mrs. Nguyen held Diane's hands in both of hers and said, in her precise, careful English, "This was not right. It was never right. I am glad it is finished. And Diane said, thank you for watching. And Mrs. Nguyen said, always. Agent Sutton found me in the parking lot as people were leaving, and she said, in her professional voice, the HUD complaint and the AG referral are going to move forward independently of tonight's events. You understand that? I said I did. She said, your documentation was excellent, Agent Webb. Then she shook my hand and walked to her car. I stood in the Sycamore Ridge Clubhouse parking lot on that clear September night with Diane beside me and Tom Gallagher a few steps away talking to Phil Kessler, and I thought about what it had taken to get here. 8 months of documentation, of patience, of choosing every morning to stay in the process instead of above it, and I thought about the Pattersons who had fought their own version of this 2 years earlier and hadn't won as completely. I called Mr. Patterson that night, after we got home and the kids were in bed, and I told him what had happened, and he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, how did it feel? And I said, like it was worth doing. He said, yeah, that's the right answer. The formal consequences began arriving over the following weeks in the measured, institutional rhythm that is the signature of systems taking their time to do something thoroughly. The Georgia Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division formally opened an investigation into the HOA's enforcement practices within 10 days of the community meeting. The combination of the fraudulent violation notices, the expired inspector report, and the self-dealing investigation contract gave them more than enough to proceed. The HUD Fair Housing complaint, filed jointly by Sandra on behalf of me, the Pattersons, the Nguyen's, Gloria Chun, and 3 other homeowners, was accepted for investigation within the same week, and HUD assigned 2 investigators who began contacting homeowners for interviews. The Georgia Real Estate Commission moved on Crestline Property Solutions, the inspection firm Renata's college roommate had incorporated, and revoked its operating license, finding that it had conducted inspections without properly licensed personnel and had issued reports used to impose financial penalties on homeowners. Meridian Consulting Group, the firm Renata's husband's cousin had run, was referred to the Fulton County DA's office for possible unlicensed private investigation activity. In Georgia, conducting surveillance on individuals for compensation requires a PI license, and Meridian's principals had none. The impersonation of law enforcement matter was referred to the Fulton County DA as well. The yellow vests, the fake badges, and the written warnings implying official authority were collectively sufficient for a misdemeanor charge under Georgia Code Section October 16, 23. Gary Pruitt, the man who had come to my porch in the yellow vest, cooperated fully with investigators. He was not charged. He came to my door one afternoon without the vest, without a badge, without a golf cart, and he said, Mr. Webb, I owe you an apology. I didn't know what I was involved in. And I shook his hand and told him I believed him, and I meant it. The HOA's independent legal audit, conducted by a firm with no prior relationship to Renata or the board, found 43 enforcement actions over 3 years that could not be supported by the documentation in the HOA's own files, meaning the fines had been issued without a documented basis. Of those 43, 31 had been issued to homeowners of color. The audit report noted this disparity in a single dry sentence that carried more weight than a paragraph of editorial commentary ever could. Renata had resigned from the board on the morning after the community meeting, a resignation submitted by email at 2:47 a.m., which tells you something about the night she had, and she had done so without explanation, without apology, and without acknowledging any of the concerns that had been raised. But resignation didn't stop the consequences from following her. The AG investigation named her individually as the person who had directed the enforcement campaign and authorized the expenditures, and her personal liability was distinct from the HOA's institutional liability. Her attorney, a different attorney from Whitmore, someone she had presumably hired in the 2 weeks after losing her HOA counsel, sent Sandra a letter proposing a settlement discussion, and Sandra called me to relay the offer. She wants to settle, Sandra said. Globally, meaning she wants to resolve everything with one agreement. She's proposing an apology letter, reimbursement of all fines, and a contribution to a community fund. I asked Sandra what she thought, and Sandra said, "I think she's terrified of the HUD process because of finding there follows her everywhere. It goes into a federal database that landlords, employers, and HOAs check." She paused. "She should be terrified of it." I thought about it for 24 hours, which is how long I give myself on any decision I want to make well, and I told Sandra I would agree to settle the private claims if the contribution to the community fund was substantial, the apology was specific and in writing, and the settlement explicitly did not release Renata from the regulatory investigations, which were not mine to settle anyway. Sandra sent back those terms, and Renata's attorney accepted them within 48 hours, which told me that the regulatory exposure was even more significant than I had estimated. The settlement required Renata to pay $22,000, the full value of all fines imposed on my property, plus the Pattersons' costs from their 2-year enforcement campaign, plus a contribution to a Sycamore Ridge Community Equity Fund that Phil Kessler and Gloria Chun agreed to administer. The apology letter, which was required to be sent to every homeowner in Sycamore Ridge, was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph acknowledged that enforcement had been applied inequitably. The second acknowledged that the HOA patrol had been operated without proper legal authority. The third said, in specific terms, that the actions directed at my family had been wrong. I read that letter sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with coffee, and I read it twice, and then I folded it and put it in the documentation file, and I thought, that is the most honest thing Renata Holloway has ever said, and it cost her more than she ever imagined it would. The HUD investigation continued independently of the settlement, as it should, and 18 months later, HUD issued a finding of reasonable cause, determining that the HOA's enforcement pattern over 3 years constituted a violation of the Fair Housing Act's prohibition on discrimination in the terms and conditions of housing. That finding, as Sandra had predicted, went into a federal database. Renata Holloway's name is in that database. It will follow her for a very long time. The AG investigation resulted in a consent decree between the state and the HOA. The HOA was required to implement an unbiased enforcement protocol, retain fair housing training for all board members, and submit to independent monitoring for 3 years. The Fulton County DA declined to pursue the impersonation charges criminally, a judgment call I respect, because the individual actors like Gary Pruitt were victims of the scheme, rather than architects of it. But the DA's office sent a formal letter to the HOA noting that the activity had constituted a civil rights violation and preserving the record. There was one more thing, a detail I had not anticipated and that no one told me about directly, but that I learned from Phil Kessler over dinner at the Gallagher's house about 4 months after the community meeting. Phil told me that on the night after the community meeting, the same night Renata had emailed her resignation at 2:47 a.m., her husband had come home from a business trip to find her sitting in their living room with the lights off, the printed presentation on the coffee table, and she had looked at him and said, "I think I became someone I don't recognize." Phil said he had heard this from Renata's husband directly. They had been friendly for years before any of this happened, and that Renata's husband had said his wife had spent the following week in something like shock, not defensive, not plotting, just quiet. I sat with that for a moment. I didn't know what to do with it exactly. It didn't change what had happened. It didn't make the Pattersons' 2 years of fines unhappen. It didn't undo the sleepless nights Diane and I had spent at that kitchen table. But it was human, and I try not to lose sight of human things even when I'm in the middle of a fight. I am not going to tell you that Renata Holloway became a different person because I don't know that, and I don't want to offer redemption that isn't mine to grant. What I can tell you is that she became quieter, and that she stopped appearing at neighborhood events, and that the one time I saw her, in the parking lot of the Publix on Route 9, 8 months after the community meeting, she looked at me across 3 rows of cars and then looked away and kept walking, and neither of us said anything. Sometimes the most honest ending is the one where nobody speaks. Sycamore Ridge changed slowly and then all at once, in the way that communities change when the thing that had been quietly wrong is finally named and addressed. The tension that had been ambient in every HOA meeting, every violation notice, every carefully worded newsletter dissolved, and what replaced it was something that felt, for the first time, like an actual neighborhood. Phil Kessler was elected HOA president at the next general election, running unopposed, and his first act was to reduce the rulebook from 47 pages to 18 and to eliminate the tiered fee structure that had been the financial engine of Renata's enforcement campaign. Gloria Chun joined the board and established a homeowner advisory process. Anyone receiving a violation notice could request a hearing before a panel that included 2 non-board homeowners. And the number of formal violations dropped by 63% in the first year, which tells you everything you need to know about what the violations had actually been for. The Pattersons planted a garden in their front yard that is, by any measure, not entirely compliant with the HOA's landscaping guidelines. It has sunflowers, which are not on the approved species list, and Phil Kessler has declined to notice, and nobody has complained, and the sunflowers are enormous and beautiful every August. Jordan, my 14-year-old, asked me one evening what had happened with the HOA. He had known something serious was going on, but we had kept the details from the kids, and I told him the straightforward version. There was a person who was using rules to treat people unfairly, and we documented it, and we worked with attorneys and officials, and eventually the system worked. He thought about that and said, "But it took a really long time." And I said, "Yes, it did." And he said, "What if you weren't an FBI agent?" And I looked at him for a long moment before I said, "That's the right question. That's exactly the right question." The honest answer is that it would have been harder. The Pattersons had an attorney and they prevailed, but it cost them more and took longer and left marks that ours didn't. Gary Pruitt, who came to my door in good faith and was used, had no resources to push back on anything. The system worked for us, this time, in this place, and I hold that with gratitude and with the clear-eyed understanding that gratitude is not the same as satisfaction, and that the work is bigger than one neighborhood and one HOA president. I kept the documentation file, all 3 binders, the 2 external hard drives, every certified mail receipt, every text message, every time-stamped photograph. I kept all of it organized and labeled in the filing cabinet in my home office, not because I expect to need it again, but because the work of documentation is itself a form of respect for what happened. Sandra Okafor sent me a bottle of scotch with a card that said, "To the most organized client I have ever had," and I laughed, which I needed to, and I called her to say thank you, and she said, "Thank you for trusting the process." And then she paused and said, "And for being patient enough to let me do my job." Teresa Ramos sent nothing. Teresa never sends things. But at our next monthly supervisor meeting, she said, "Atlanta Civil Rights appreciated the documentation. They're using the Sycamore Ridge case in their training materials." And she moved on to the next agenda item, which is exactly how Teresa acknowledges things, and it meant more than the scotch. Tom Gallagher had us over for a backyard cookout in October, the first fall weather cookout, ribs and coleslaw and people standing around with beers while the kids ran in the yard. And at some point in the evening he raised his glass and said, without any preamble or ceremony, "To the Webbs who showed us how to do it right." And people raised their glasses, and that was the whole speech, and it was the right length. Diane made a dish to pass and wore her favorite yellow dress and laughed at everything and danced with Jordan and Priya on the grass. And I stood for a moment on the edge of Tom's patio and watched my family in that light, and I thought, this is what we were protecting, this right here, this exact ordinary thing. The morning after the cookout, I sat at my kitchen table with the first coffee of the day and pulled out a legal pad and made a list. The same kind of list I always make when a case is closed, of what I had learned, what had worked, what I would do differently, what I wanted to carry forward. What I would do differently. I would have called Sandra sooner, and I would have been more explicit with Diane earlier about how serious it had become, because she deserved to be a full partner in the decision-making from the start, not someone I was managing information toward. What had worked? Patience, documentation, process, trusting the right people with the right information at the right time, and refusing, at every single moment, to become the thing Renata Holloway needed me to be to justify her version of events. What I wanted to carry forward. The question Jordan asked, what if you weren't an FBI agent? Because that question points toward the gap between justice and access to justice, and I am not content to live in that gap without trying to close it. I thought about the Pattersons, and I called Mr. Patterson and asked if he would be willing to speak to a group of homeowners in a neighboring county who had reached out to me through a fair housing advocacy organization, people dealing with their own HOA Karen, with fewer resources than we had. He said yes without hesitating. He said, "Of course, that's the point, isn't it? You don't go through something like this just for yourself." Over the following year, I worked with Sandra, the Pattersons, and a fair housing advocacy nonprofit based in Atlanta to put together a practical guide. Not a legal document, just a plain language resource for homeowners facing discriminatory or retaliatory HOA enforcement. The guide covers documentation basics, how to photograph, timestamp, and preserve evidence, how to request HOA records under state law, how to identify patterns of selective enforcement, and when and how to engage an attorney, a state agency, or a federal body. It covers the emotional reality too, because Diane insisted, and she was right, the experience of living under sustained harassment in your own home, the effect on children, the way that institutional injustice has a cumulative weight that doesn't show up in legal filings. We called it Know Your Walls, Diane named it, and we distributed it through the advocacy nonprofit, through Gloria Chen's book club network, through a housing justice organization in Decatur, and eventually through Sandra's law firm's client education program. The guide has been downloaded more than 14,000 times. I know this because the nonprofit sends me an annual report, and every time I see that number I think about Jordan's question and about the Pattersons and about the 43 enforcement actions that could not be documented and the 31 homeowners of color who had received them. 14,000 downloads. 14,000 people who found that document because they were looking for exactly what it contained, which means 14,000 families in some stage of a fight that never should have had to happen. I am glad we wrote it. I am glad it exists. I am glad it is one of the things this story produced, because the best outcome of a fight is not just winning the fight but making the next fight less necessary for the people who come after you. Priya, who was 12 when all of this happened, asked me recently. She's 14 now, thoughtful in a different way than Jordan, more inclined to sit with a question before asking it. She asked me whether I ever felt angry. I told her yes, I had felt angry, and I described the specific feeling of reading the fabricated violation notices and knowing they were fabricated, of receiving the dossier that distorted my record, of watching Renata walk out of that community meeting without looking back. Priya said, "But you didn't act angry." And I said, "No, I didn't." And she said, "Was that hard?" And I said, "Yes, that was the hardest part." She thought about that for a while and then she said, "I think I understand why you did it that way." And I asked her why and she said, "Because if you'd been angry, they could have made it about your anger. This way it had to be about what they did." She's 14. She figured that out herself. I thought about Diane saying we didn't become the people they tried to make us, and I thought about the expression on Renata's face when the room's hands went up for the no confidence vote, and I thought about Gary Pruitt apologizing on my porch in his own clothes without a vest or a badge, just himself, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not vindication exactly, but a kind of completeness. The story of what happened at Sycamore Ridge has a clear ending in the legal and institutional sense. The fines were refunded, the lien was removed, the enforcement campaign was documented and adjudicated, the people responsible faced consequences proportionate to what they had done. But stories about communities and families don't end in legal filings, they continue into ordinary life. Our ordinary life at 14 Cloverfield Lane is good. Jordan made the varsity soccer team and is planning to apply to engineering programs. Priya has a part-time job at the vet's office down the road and has announced she wants to be a wildlife biologist. Diane got a promotion at her hospital and she celebrated by buying a new plant, a potted fern in a terracotta planter, which she placed on our front steps with the particular satisfaction of a woman making a point. I look at that fern every morning when I leave for work, the same kind of fern Renata cited as a violation in her very first notice to me, and I think about what it means that it's still there, and what it means that nobody has said a word about it. It means we stayed. That's the most important thing. We had every reason to leave. Renata had designed the campaign to make leaving feel like the easiest option, and we didn't because this is our home, we chose it, we built a life here, and the fact that someone didn't want us here was a reason to stay more firmly, not a reason to go. I think about all the families who were pushed out before we arrived. Homeowners who received the fines and couldn't afford Sandra Okafor, who sold at a loss or left in exhaustion, who are living somewhere else right now while their old address is occupied by someone Renata found more suitable. And I think about what I owe them. I owe them the record. I owe them the documentation that lives in the AG's files and HUD's database and Sandra's case archive. Documentation that says, this happened here to real people and it was wrong and we can prove it. I owe them the 14,000 homeowners who downloaded that guide, and whatever portion of those families were able to stay in their homes because they had information they wouldn't have had otherwise. I owe them Priya's question and Jordan's question, and the ongoing understanding that the work of equity in housing is not finished when one HOA president loses her position. It continues in every neighborhood where a family moves in and wonders if they're really welcome, and in every meeting room where someone decides whether to raise their hand or keep it down. On the first Tuesday of every month, the Sycamore Ridge HOA holds its general meeting in the same clubhouse, under the same fluorescent lights, with the same folding chairs. Phil Kessler runs the meetings. The agenda is posted 3 days in advance. There is a public comment period at the start of every session. Diane and I go most months. We bring coffee in a thermos and sit in the third row and listen to the business of the neighborhood. Landscaping updates, pool hours, the annual road maintenance schedule, and most of the time nothing dramatic happens, and that is the whole point. The community that Renata built on fear and compliance is being replaced, slowly, with a community that is building itself on transparency and shared ownership. And it is not perfect and it is not finished, but it is real, and it is ours, all of ours, in a way it never was when one woman decided who belonged. I do not miss the fight. I am glad it is over. I am glad it produced what it produced. I am glad we handled it the way we did, with patience and documentation and the steady refusal to be smaller than we were or quieter than we had the right to be. I am glad that the porch camera caught what it caught. I am glad Gary Pruitt's face went white when he saw my badge, because his shock was the beginning of the end of Renata's power. I am glad that Mrs. Nguyen told Renata to stop, and that Tom Gallagher's voice carried from the back of the room, and that Phil Kessler knew his Roberts rules well enough to turn Renata's own meeting against her. I am glad that 67 hands went up, not all at once but eventually, which is how courage works in a room. It starts with one person and moves, and by the time it's done it looks like it was always going to happen, but at the start it wasn't certain at all. I am glad Diane wears yellow. I am glad Priya asked the hard question. I am glad Jordan is old enough to ask it too, and young enough to still believe in the answer. This neighborhood, this block, this house with the terracotta planters and the fern and the porch camera and the late summer light that comes through the kitchen window every morning and falls exactly on the kitchen table where I kept vigil through 8 months of this story. This is home, and it will remain home, and nobody gets to take that from us. The sunflowers in the Pattersons' yard are blooming again this August, well above the fence line, absolutely not on the approved species list, and they are the most beautiful thing on Cloverfield Lane. The END.